Okay, it gives me great pleasure to kick off this year's seminar series with Carla Staver, who is Associate Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Yale. And she did her PhD at Princeton and a postdoc at Columbia, and has then moved on to Yale into this current position, and does a lot of work on savanna systems and dry tropical ecosystems globally, but particularly has a strong focus in Africa, which we'll hear more about today. So over to you, Carla.
Thanks very much, Edvinder. It's great to be here. I got to give an Oxford Center for Tropical Forest talk a couple of years ago in person about some of the work that we do on fire and alternative stable states, but now I'm going to talk to you about something entirely different today. So I'm going to talk to you today about some recent work that we've been doing in my group on the past, present, and future of herbivore impacts on savanna vegetation. The motivation for this type of work goes back quite some time. We didn't invent it by a long shot. I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea of the green world hypothesis. It's something that I ripped these slides out of an undergraduate lecture that I give. The green world hypothesis essentially argues that there's lots of plants on Earth, and that this is a little bit surprising given how many things there are that can eat them. So Hairston, Smith, and Slobodkin offer a couple of hypotheses for why there may be as many plants sitting around as they are, arguing that maybe it's predators that eat herbivores, and discuss the possibility of plant defenses. So we've had this green world hypothesis for some 70 years now. I've done the math wrong, 60. But there's kind of another possible solution to the green world hypothesis, which is what if the world isn't really that green? So what you're looking at on the top is the distribution, is a map of, there are many such maps of net primary productivity distributed across the Earth's ecosystems. And what you're looking at on the bottom is a proxy for ecosystem structure. So this is tree cover. There are, of course, other proxies for ecosystem structure as well. And the message here is that if you look carefully between the mismatch between these maps, there are some highly productive systems on Earth where there actually isn't very much tree cover at all. So Brazilian savannas, for example, are a great example of places that are somewhat productive, but where there really is not a lot of standing biomass, at least above ground tree biomass, and so on. So this, I was first introduced to this idea of like, what if the world really isn't that green, by a nice paper by William Bond in 2005 in the Journal of Vegetation Science, where he proposes what he calls the black and brown worlds. The reason that that's where I was introduced to this set of ideas is because I did a master's with William Bond from 2005 to 2008. And while I was doing that master's degree, I worked on a set of herbivore exposures in Shishui and Mfolozi Park in South Africa, which are pictured here. And these herbivore exposures were established in the year 2000. They wound up running through till about, I think, 2009. And each of the replicates, there's 10 replicates overall. Each of the replicates has a control where all herbivores are present. And then there's some basically graduated exposures. So you can see in the foreground here, this is what is called a rhino exposure. Essentially what it is a low cable that functions on the principle that rhinos basically aren't very good at like picking up their feet or jumping. And so it tends to exclude rhinos from this area once they accept that it's there and don't just push it over. And then what you're seeing in the left-hand side of the screen is the total exposure. So this has chicken wire at the bottom. It's basically a chicken wire fence that's fairly tall. So things have trouble jumping over it. And it excludes fairly small stuff down to hares. There's 5 of these in the wet end of the park and 5 of these in the drier end of the park. In the wet end, there's 2 additional treatments where there's like basically more graduated exposures that are intended to exclude zebra enlarger and impala enlarger. So this is basically where essentially where I cut my teeth in ecology, was working on these herbivore impacts on these savanna ecosystems in Shishui and Mfolozi Park. And what we found, now dividing herbivore effects up into grass versus tree response, is that excluding herbivores results in a big increase in standing grass biomass across both mesic and arid systems. So as you exclude more and more types of herbivores, you get more and more grass biomass, especially at that transition there from once you exclude the impala. That's what makes the big difference here. And by the same token, when you exclude herbivores from these exposures, you also see a big increase in tree height over the course of the experiment. We are by absolutely no means the first people to observe this, so we've done this. These are just the African experiments, and these are just a selection of the African experiments. And so this is something that is widely observed. The idea that herbivores have a big impact on savanna vegetation structure is widely observed and has been widely studied. But it's not actually been synthesized very satisfactorily. There's in 2018, there was a really nice review paper of herbivore exposures globally, which reported that there, again, that pattern that we observe a lot of herbivore impacts on ecosystems. And you can see here that the effect size herbivores tend to have a negative effect on both biomass and abundance of plants. But they also conclude that the strength of that herbivore effect is not predictable, and that it's highly site specific. Like, it varies, but it's highly site specific, and it's not predicted by any of the basic site conditions that you can capture in a global meta-analysis. And so they essentially conclude that yes, herbivores matter. How much they matter varies, and that we basically don't understand why it varies. And so this is where the new stuff I'm going to tell you about comes in. To do that, I want to first introduce a couple of categories of herbivores. I sort of already referred to the idea of grass versus tree impacts as being different in savanna ecosystems. And to parallel that difference, I want to differentiate between herbivores that eat basically trees versus grass. So what you have here is some carbon isotopic diet composition, just basic diet composition data showing variation in the degree to which, so dietary C4 is grass, and dietary C3 in a tropical savanna would be the tree component. So what percent of grass do these herbivores have in their diets? And you can see that there's a diverse guild of herbivores that eat exclusively grass across wet and dry seasons, but there's a somewhat less but still diverse guild of herbivores that eat mostly trees across both wet and dry seasons. And then there's a couple of things in the middle that tend to eat a little bit more grass in the wet season and a little bit more browse in the dry season. And those break up into what we refer to as grazers, pictured on the right, zebra, buffalo, warthog, wildebeest. Browsers, pictured on the left. I wish I hadn't started telling you what these animals are. Giraffe, obviously. Kudu, obviously. And then steenbok, somebody could correct me. And then my personal favorite mixed feeder on the bottom left-hand corner there is the impala. But elephants would also enter into this. And then by some definition, you could also get nyala. Those are much less diverse, but they are very abundant. And so we're going to consider the effect of these things maybe separately. So to do this, before I start giving you results, though, I'd like to make some predictions. And so these are the three, grazers on the left, mixed feeders in the middle, and browsers on the right. So the basic prediction that I'm going to make is that herbivore impacts depend on herbivore abundance. It's not what Giad et al. Found, but it is hopefully you'll agree that it is quite a logical working hypothesis. And the corollary to that hypothesis would be that things that are abundant will have outsized impacts. So mixed feeders, migratory grazers, megaherbivores, and so on. For me, this hypothesis is so obvious that it's sort of a little bit like, well, of course, that's the hypothesis. Why would you even bother testing such a thing? And I actually think that there are some reasonable alternative hypotheses, and it's worth talking about what those are to motivate the idea that this is worth actually asking about explicitly. So what are those alternatives? The first is that rare herbivores can have a selective impact at specific demographic stages. And so you can find examples, for instance, in the savanna literature looking at porcupine effects, especially in interaction with fire on tree survival in savannas, arguing that porcupines have a very large effect. And that's despite the fact that porcupines have extremely low biomass in these systems. And so on down the line, there are examples of rare herbivores having outsized impacts by very specific targeted effects that aren't necessarily consumptive effects, but that nevertheless impact ecosystem structure. Another possibility is that the timing of herbivory matters. This is related to the idea that rare herbivores can have an effect, but it doesn't have to be. that especially herbivory at young life stages, so seedling life stages or sapling life stages, might have outsized impacts that multiply into ecosystem, like changes in ecosystem structure that are out of proportion to the amount of biomass consumed. So this is intimately tied to the idea of demographic bottlenecks, right? So small effects at certain plant life history stages could have large ecosystem consequences. And then finally, there's also good reasons to suppose that environmental conditions could matter. So this is via plant growth, via forage nutrition, and so on. And so there's lots of papers out there arguing that where a system is, or essentially, yeah, the environmental conditions should matter for determining herbivore impacts to some extent. And you can see that hypothesis implied in Gia et al.'s surprise that they didn't find any predictors with respect to environmental conditions. So there are alternative hypotheses that, in my opinion, make it worth asking whether herbivore impacts really do depend on herbivore abundance, intuitive as that prediction is. So let's go ahead and test that hypothesis. To do this, we basically digitized published herbivore exclusion studies from a variety of systems in Africa, pictured here on the left. There's herbivore exclusion experiments from Kruger National Park in South Africa and Mfulozzi Park in South Africa. You can see those pictured in the lower inset. And then there's a whole bunch of experiments in East Africa. So there's a range of exposures across the Serengeti and at Impala Research Center, pictured in the upper inset. And there's also, we found a neat herbivore exposure experiment in Ethiopia in the Tigray region. And each of those, the requirement was that each of those have like a herbivore exclusion treatment. And in this case, we compared only full exclusion to all herbivores present and looked at the effects of those. And then we're most interested in whether the size of the herbivore exclusion effect is related to how many herbivores there are in the system, right? And so that required us to go out, usually using different sources. Actually, oddly enough, a lot of herbivore exclusion studies, including the ones that I myself have published, don't actually report herbivore densities necessarily alongside their herbivore exclusion effects. So we went and digitized a bunch of, Gareth Hempson did all the digitization of herbivore population densities at each of the herbivore exclusion sites. And what we find is that more grazing animals tend to have more impact on the grass layer, which does not translate into effects that, like, more browsers doesn't equal more grass impact. Rather, it's the actual graze, like the presence of grazers. So it's grazers and mixed feeders together that have the largest impact. And by the same token, that more browsing animals in the ecosystem results in more impact on the tree component of the ecosystem. And again, that grazers are particularly predictive of tree impacts. So we have, I think, probably some really basic confirmation of the idea that more herbivores have more impacts on savanna ecosystems. What's really curious, though, is when you start to go in and try to compare these impacts to estimates of, like, basically predicted consumption from metabolic rate calculations. And so what you're looking at here is, on the x-axis, an estimate of how much we think the herbivores that live in that system should need to eat. And then on the y-axis, the observed fractional impact. So that's the exclusion versus all herbivores present treatment. And you can see that rates of impact here are, the rates of impact, so the y-axis are to about, on average, 2.1 times higher than estimated metabolic demand. So herbivores are having much larger impacts than you would predict based on their metabolic needs. My original idea for this was something related to the idea of demographic seasonal bottleneck space. Oh, I should also say that this exercise is only possible for the grass component of this ecosystem, and the tree component of this is much trickier. So what you're looking at here is grass consumption versus grass fractional impact. So my original hypothesis had been that there were seasonal bottlenecks in the system. We submitted this review paper, which sort of basically identified the conundrum and then advance some plausible hypotheses for why that might be. And our paper got sent for review to Johan du Toit, who brought our attention to this very neat paper from 2000 that actually quantifies base metabolic rate of herbivores across different ecosystems globally. I draw your attention particularly to the tropical components of this study. And so you can see where the metabolic scaling constant of 0.75 comes from. So those neotropical Indo-Malayan and Australasian animals tend to have base metabolic rates that sort of hover around there. But by contrast, Afrotropical, especially large-bodied Afrotropical herbivores, tend to have base metabolic rates that are actually much higher than that, right? And so that 0.75 scaling exponent is really no good for Afrotropical herbivores, which we're dealing with here. And so when we adjust our estimates, we did a sort of messy job here, but when we adjust our estimates to include that different scaling exponent for African wildlife, what we get is that actually accurate metabolic rates predict impact quite well. And so the dotted line there is the one-to-one line. And you can see that the relationship between estimated impact and observed impact is actually, it's pretty good. I think that also maybe emphasizes some other interesting features of this. So potentially, for instance, the points that are circled here in black are all points from exclosures in the Serengeti ecosystem. So really high biomass or high grazer biomass systems tend to be located in the Serengeti. And those are systems where grazing is very intense when it's intense, but where it is potentially episodic in nature, right? It happens sometimes, but not always. And so there's somewhat smaller herbivore impacts in systems where herbivory only happens some of the time, compared to systems where herbivory is maybe lower level but constant through time. This is a hypothesis that has been posed for wildlife in 1991 by Osterheld and McNaughton, tested by Ritchie and Penner, but it's also very similar to, if you're familiar at all with rotational grazing systems and livestock systems. So this is an idea that really is out there, and we see it maybe playing out here. All right. So revisiting those hypotheses that we made, I think we probably have I hopefully you agree with me that we have strong support for the idea that herbivore impacts depend on herbivore abundance, and that things that are abundant, especially in this case, migratory grazers, but also maybe mixed feeders, have outsized impacts. I'm not going to dive into the mega herbivore story. They definitely had impacts. If you're interested, check out the paper. We can talk about it more in the Q&A. They had impacts. They had large impacts because they have large biomass, but they didn't have particularly large impacts. So their impacts were proportional to their abundance. I think we didn't see any particular evidence for the idea that rare herbivores matter a lot. And then there's this idea of episodic grazing, right? So there's some support for the idea that the timing of herbivory matters. The reason I put a check question mark there is that I wanted to basically remind myself to come back to the question of trees. So, you know, we've got a little bit more resolution on the question of grazer impacts on grass here. But the tree question is kind of different. It's actually something I've thought about it a little bit more in the work that I've done. Trees, by virtue of being so much longer lived, in my opinion, trees by virtue of being so much longer lived potentially can accumulate like basically episodes of impact throughout their lifespan. And so we are more likely to see bottlenecks playing out in the tree layer than in the grass layer. And there's a variety of, there's a diversity of work on that in the literature, but not much convincing synthesis for the idea that that you really sort of like something that synthesizes how we should be thinking about browser effects on the tree layer. So I think there's still some work to be done on that issue. But I also wanted to basically, you know, I didn't say anything about environmental conditions. The meta-analysis that we did based on just a few points, I think we found no statistical support for the idea that environmental conditions shape herbivore impacts at all. However, I'm not personally particularly convinced by that because we didn't actually capture a lot of environmental variation in that study. And so you'd really want to do, you'd want to dive into that question in a little bit more detail to actually get at that. And so to do that, I'd like to basically burrow a little bit deeper into these results. But before we do that, I'd like to make a couple other hypotheses for you. So the first on the left-hand side is the idea that a herbivore is just a herbivore, right? And so on the left-hand side, what you're seeing here is along an environmental range. Let's take the left-hand side upper top right-hand corner, along a rainfall gradient where we expect productivity, grass biomass to increase. We see in the exclosure, obviously grass biomass increases, and then potentially, and then we're looking at the effects of a constant density of herbivores, so constant metabolic demand across that rainfall gradient. So what we're saying there is that like herbivores just need to eat grass, and that the same number of herbivores eat the same amount of grass, irrespective of where they are along the rainfall gradient, right? So all that matters on the left-hand column there is how many herbivores you have, and that the magnitude of impact will just scale with the number of herbivores that there are, the biomass of herbivores that are eating grass. So you could have this, you could generate that hypothesis with respect to rainfall, and then on the bottom, what you have is sand, percent sand as a proxy for soil nutrition, where in that case, more sand probably means less nutritious soil, less grass productivity. But again, maybe a herbivore is just a herbivore. But there are other possibilities here. So in the middle column, what you're looking at is a hypothesis that's centered around maybe site selection or population dynamic that differ depending on the location along the environmental gradients. And so I think this is a hypothesis that makes particular sense in the case of sand. And so what you're looking at here is essentially grass biomass, although system level herbivore numbers might be the same, there's some site selection going on at the sub-landscape level that means that herbivore impacts might be smaller in more nutrient poor patches than they are in more nutrient rich patches, right? So we might see impacts that are smaller in poorer quality patches. That is a hypothesis that has an analog in the rainfall case, but rainfall gradients tend to be so much stronger that we might not observe them as much in reality. And then finally, on the right-hand side, you have another hypothesis whereby essentially poor forage quality means that herbivores, the same number of herbivores need to eat more food where forage is poorer in quality. And so that's to say when rainfall is higher and grass C/N ratios increase, we might tend to see herbivores eating more in order to satisfy their basic metabolic demands. And by the same token, on sandier or more nutrient poor soils, we might tend to see herbivores needing to eat, again, more food to satisfy their nutritional demands. And so this is essentially, hopefully providing some resolution on the idea that environment could matter above and beyond just its effects on determining how many herbivores there are. And so to test that, what we did is that we actually compiled a bunch of raw data from a bunch of different sites. And so this is a paper that's going to have many, many, many co-authors. And what you can see is hopefully that on the left hand, what you can see is that grazer density matters more than anything else. And it sort of matters to the exclusion of everything else, basically. So on the bottom left-hand corner, grazer plus basically half of mixed feeder density, metabolic biomass is a strong predictor of changing grass biomass with herbivore exclusion, changing grass biomass with herbivore exclusion. Whereas sand content, rainfall, and previous year rainfall, because rainfall lags are widely observed in systems like these, have much, much smaller effects. Sand effects are a little bit larger than rainfall effects. I'd say rainfall effects are negligible to non-existent. And sand maybe does have a little bit of that negative relationship that we're expecting, which could reflect, again, that site selection hypothesis. But to a first approximation, a herbivore is basically a herbivore, even with much, much better data. And the environmental context in which a herbivore is eating matters much less than just the fact that a herbivore is there eating stuff. This is just to remind me that there are documented trends in proportional reduction in gross biomass with herbivore exclusion in the literature. And if this is something we actually thought about this a good amount, and if you're interested in this question, we could talk about it during the Q&A. But I'm not going to say much more about that here. And I just want to leave you with the idea that to a first approximation of herbivore is the herbivore. Okay. So hopefully what I've motivated for you here is the idea that we actually have some pretty good leverage on the question of what determines the severity of herbivore impacts on savanna vegetation in the present day, right? So there's good experimental leverage on this question. But we're also interested in the past and the future. And so in order to think about the past and the future, we have a couple of different tools at our disposal. One is hypotheses about what makes herbivores abundant. So we have some conceptual understanding on that question. So the first is that abundant herbivores should be large, since they probably escape predation. I don't have anything novel to offer you on this question, since this has been, I think, really conclusively studied by a number of people. This related to the mega herbivore concept from Norman Owen Smith, published in 1988, but also to some really seminal work from Tony Sinclair and colleagues, published in 2003, which is where the graph you're seeing here comes from, looking at essentially the weight of a herbivore and the rate at which they experience predation. And you can see that smaller bodied herbivores experience near exclusive, basically they all die from being predated, whereas larger bodied herbivores, that's rhino, hippo, elephant, are rarely, if ever, predated. And so there are good reasons to suppose that large body size could lead to abundance because of escape from predation. There's a couple of other processes that could contribute as well. So we also think that abundant herbivores should have flexible diets to escape these forage bottlenecks, which you're looking at on the bottom. I can give you a date. This is a paper from last year that Gareth Hempson and I wrote together, looking at trends in herbivore population densities across African reserves, across well-conserved African reserves. And you can see that there's an increase in individual density and in metabolic biomass density with increasing degree of diet mixing. So those mixed feeders are over there on the right side of the graph. And then things that don't mix feed are on the left. So that could include browsers and grazers. What's really interesting is that we've separated the migratory populations of grazers out of this analysis. And so the yellow points there are migratory grazers. And you can see that there's essentially two ways to achieve dietary flexibility. One is to migrate. So that's spatial flexibility in diet composition. And the other is change in diet composition seasonally. But irrespective of the type of diet flexibility, it is quite clear that being able to switch your diet seasonally has big positive effects on population density. This is true on a continental scale, but it's also true on a smaller scale in response to more extreme conditions. And so what you're looking at here is the response of both spatial landscape use and then diet composition, tree versus grass diet composition in response to a large drought that occurred in Kruger National Park in 2016. And you can see that both grazers and mega herbivores tended to essentially migrate away from the drought in search of forage refugia, whereas mixed feeders instead changed their composition but didn't do much spatial movement. Flexibility can mitigate both seasonal forage bottlenecks, but also more rare, more severe bottlenecks. And this has translated in the past. Oh, there's a mistake I was doing. Can I just exit out of here? Sorry about that. This translates in the. We think that what this means for the past, you don't really just have to generate hypotheses to think about the past of herbivore abundance. You can also look to actual data. And so what you're looking at here is reconstructions of, in this case, the diversity of grazers, browsers, and mixed feeders in the paleo record compared to their abundances today. And so on the left-hand side, that's adapted from some data from Tyler Faith, published in 2019, showing that there's a big increase on the timescale of millions of years ago. There's a big increase in herbivore abundance or herbivore diversity, grazer diversity that peaks, let's say a million, just over a million years ago. But that has fallen off from a million years to today. And conversely, that mixed feeders make up a much larger fraction of the relative diversity of herbivores in Africa than they did a million years ago. And so you can see that we think that the past tended to have more grazers and fewer mixed feeders, right? Than it does, certainly more grazers than it does today. That doesn't just have to be true on paleo timescales. We also think that's true on historical timescales. So what you're looking at here is adapted from some work by Harris et al. In 2009, looking at extant versus extinct migrations, showing that historically there were many more migratory species and much more migratory biomass, especially among grazers. And so there's somewhere like in the there's about a 30% reduction in, at least a 30% reduction. It's like a documented 30% reduction in migratory grazer biomass since 100 years ago or so. And so again, towards an argument that the past probably had more grazers than we observe in savannas today. This probably shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. We think that the reason that is, the reason for that is essentially that we have fencing and fragmentation that makes grazing, that makes large migrations more difficult. But it also makes grazers more susceptible to mortality, even under normal conditions, but also during droughts. And what you're seeing here is modern percent mortality during drought among different guilds. And so grazers, you can see there that grazer strategy of migrating to escape drought is not as possible in a fragmented landscape, resulting in much more drought mortality than among certainly mixed feeders and browsers. Again, mega herbivores also, because probably of their large body size, are a little bit better able to survive droughts too. But the combination of fragmentation with potentially events like these could result in grazers being uniquely exposed to extinction or conservation threats. This also shouldn't come as a surprise. Even in Africa, where we have an extant herbivore community, there's been a large decrease in mega herbivore richness into the present. So the past probably also had more mega herbivores than we see today. Okay. So what this lets us say is, if you buy the idea that a herbivore is a herbivore and more herbivores equals more herbivore impacts, and that we sort of know some stuff from the paleo record about trends in herbivore, at least diversity, maybe also abundance through time, then you could say probably there was more grazer impacts in the past than there are today, maybe also more mega herbivore impacts in the past than there are today. But we got to thinking about whether there was some way to look at this directly and whether there's some way to directly test that idea, right? And so what we've done here, so this work is in progress. It's work by my postdoc Allison in preparation. And what you're seeing here, we're basically making use of the idea that there were megafaunal extinctions of varying severity across continents. And what you see here is, so basically we're looking at North America, South America, Africa, and Australia, which have really strong fossil records of megafaunal extinction. And you could see that there's variation in extinction severity, both in terms of what types of herbivores died off, but also just how many died off, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to compare those extinctions to changes not in vegetation directly, because it's really hard to come up with like a grass biomass proxy. But what we're going to compare it to is to changes in grassy fire regimes. And so we know that fires tend to burn more frequently when there's more grass biomass around. And so the prediction would be that when there's less grazers eating grass, there's more grass around and therefore more fire activity. And so what we're doing here is basically taking those megafaunal extinction windows and evaluating the change in fire occurrence across that window to ask whether we see a pulse in fire activity associated with megafaunal extinction. And in fact, what we see here, and basically the crucial panel here is the one on the top left-hand corner. On the x-axis, you see grazer extinction severity, so what proportion of the grazer community died off, and then change in fire activity on the y-axis. And that's for grassy ecosystems. And you can see that there's a strong positive relationship. So when more grazers died, fire activity tends to increase more. I will tell you what the other panels are, though. You can see there that panel B, top right-hand corner, looks at browser extinction severity on the x-axis versus change in grassy fire activity. And you can see that strong relationship is not there, right? So browser extinction is not having the same effect on fire activity as grazer extinction is, which is to be expected. There's no mechanistic relationship there. And by the same token, the bottom row there is looking at changes in fire activity in non-grassy ecosystems. And so neither grazers actually nor browsers predict changes in fire severity in those non-grassy ecosystems. So this is some sort of at least proof of principle of the idea that there were more grazers around before the megafaunal extinctions, and that is likely to have had strong impacts both on vegetation communities and then on other processes that also depend on vegetation communities. Okay, and so I'd like to leave you, I think I'm just about out of time here anyway. I was aiming for 45 minutes. So I'd like to leave you with this idea. So I talked a little bit about the past, where we think there were probably more migratory grazers, so more grazers kicking around the system, having stronger impacts on the grass layer, which have stronger top-down controls on fire behavior, with possible impacts on the tree layer as well. And then the question is, what's likely to happen into the future? We think that, well, we know it's easy to quantify the idea that there are many, many fewer wild grazers, especially than there used to be. There's either as many or more mixed feeders than there used to be. So those go some way towards substituting for migratory grazer effects. But broadly speaking, we think there's probably more grass biomass accumulation happening in the system, which then results in more fire activity. The conundrum, and you can see there that the pink arrows that I've drawn there are about sort of basically uncertainties. So on the left-hand side, there's some uncertainty around how migratory grazers interact with the tree layer directly. I'm not so sure whether that's a really important uncertainty or not. But what I am sure is that there's uncertainties around bottom-up controls on productivity and essentially vegetation growth in savannas. And so that could be constraints from changing soil moisture, changing soil nutrition, and then CO2 fertilization. So all of these herbivore impacts are happening in the context of other forcing processes that make outcomes for ecosystem structure a little bit uncertain. But where it's fairly clear that there's fewer wild grazers having big impacts on ecosystems than there were 1 million and even 150 years ago. Hopefully you've noticed that I've been careful there to say wild grazers, because this is all bets are off at agricultural ecosystems, and whereas wild ungulates are having declining trends in grazer abundance, obviously there's a lot of livestock around having big effects on grass biomass and possibly again on fire activity. So there's some nice work from 2017 from Yale looking at declining trends in mesic fire regime activity in Africa, which is potentially attributable to increases in livestock grazing. I like this photo because cows aren't supposed to eat trees, but sometimes they do. All right, but I'd like to just leave you with the idea that basically in the past, we think there were probably more grazers, maybe fewer mixed feeders, and almost certainly more mega herbivores, not fewer. And we think that the future probably continues that trend. And so what we're looking towards is a future dominated by mixed feeder browsers. So for those of you who do fieldwork in African ecosystems, next time you go out and you see an impala, realize that you're looking at like a miracle of nature. You know, it is an organism that is beautifully designed to deal with the future. But that we have to think carefully about how to, you know, how to manage around a changing herbivore community that has substantial impact on those ecosystems. So I owe huge thanks to a number of people. A lot of the work that I presented to you today was led by my postdoc, Allison. She's a paleo-fire ecologist. And so we're interested in some of these paleo-fire, paleo-herbivory interactions. I also talked to you about work from Joel Abraham. He's currently a PhD student in Rob Pringle's lab at Princeton. But he was an undergraduate at Yale. And so the work that I showed you was his undergraduate senior thesis work. So he's an absolute phenomenon, and he's going to do great things. He's already doing great things. So keep an eye out for him. I'd also like to acknowledge a number of really fun collaborators. So first of all, William Bond, who I think basically introduced me to fieldwork and savanna ecosystems. I certainly wouldn't be here if it weren't for him. Gareth Hempson has been a lot of fun to work. He's basically the reason I started working on Herbivory again after a little bit of a hiatus post-master's degree. So I've been having a lot of fun working with him. Tyler Faith and Jen Marlin have contributed to this paleo work. Both of them are really creative and interesting people to interact with. And then of course, folks in Kruger who have contributed to this Herbivory work, Corley Wigley Kitsia, Ben Wigley, and Judith Boeta. So thanks to all of them for their contributions and for their collaboration. And thanks to you all for listening. And I hope you have lots of questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Carla. Terrific, absolutely terrific. Do you want to stop sharing your screen?
Sure
Make
thing.
it open up for questions.
Yeah.
Terrific. Okay, well, so we'll open up to questions now. So feel free to either raise your hand or pop a question in the chat box that I can share across. And I'll invite you, if you're able to, I'll invite you to directly ask Carla your questions. But if you can't for any reason, I can convey them across. While we're waiting for questions to pop in, Carla, and also just switch on your cameras. It's nice, for those of you who are comfortable doing that, it's nice to see faces in the audience for the discussion phase. So do switch on your cameras if you can. Amazing. I was really fascinated, as you'd probably guessed, by your looking at the past as well and modeling the effects of the past extinctions on that. And the result with fire severity, with South America right at the top there, in terms of grazer loss and then fire severity, was really quite compelling. One question I had was actually, I was just struck on the decline in grazers in Africa over the last million years that I, for one, wasn't particularly aware of. And has that been causally explained? Is it linked to increasing hominid presence and Homo erectus and things? Or what's the reason why grazers have been dropping off in Africa on the million-year time scale?
That's a great question, and I'm definitely not the right person to answer that. My understanding of the mega herbivore extinctions in general is that there's a lot of controversy about that, and that there's a variety of hypotheses, human influences, but also changing. The reason that am I allowed to reshare again, maybe?
Yeah, sure.
The reason that we plotted these again, I think the reason that we plotted these against, the person to answer this question is Tyler Faith. So I would take his word above mine any day. The reason that I've apparently deleted the C4 grass contribution here from the diet composition graph, but you can see it here in gray in the mega herbivores graph. So what you see here is a change in proportional C4 contribution. So that's reflecting some, I think, changes in some paleoclimates as well over that time scale. And so you see the C4 grass contribution is thought to drive some of that increase in grazer abundance, but it's true that there's that decrease in grazer abundance. The other person who could, Allison, I think you're probably here, and if you want to weigh in on this question, I think some of that is. Are you willing to field that?
I'm here.
Oh, great, you are here. Fantastic. Allison, do you have a contribution to make on that question?
Yeah, so it's it hasn't been linked to hominids. In fact, the paper it's from explicitly disconnects those two things. But you basically got it right. There's climate-driven vegetation changes and turnover in the gills that are at least what's currently that pattern is attributed to, and that this shift is on a different time scale than the stuff with fire that we're looking at later. So it's much more long-term climate-oriented stuff. Yeah.
What's the long-term shift in climate that's driving this decline in grazers? Do you recall?
I actually don't know that off the top of my head. Like Carla said, this is Tyler's baby. So I think they did less explicit work linking things to climate specifically and more focused on vegetation-oriented shifts. So that's also a whole controversial topic about what pieces of climate are responsible for those changes in vegetation.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, we can open up to other questions. Anybody got a question? I'm sure you have, don't be shy now. Okay, Nikki?
I was just not really a scientific question, but just out of interest. You looked at the extinction rates of Asia, of Africa, and America and Australia. Anything in Europe, or just not because there's not a lot of fire? Why exclude Europe? And if any reason, what do you think's going on there?
I'm going to throw that question to Allison as well. The short answer is that it's essentially availability of fossil records and availability of paleofire records. And so there's in Asia and Europe, it's harder to come by good concurrent fossil record match. And Allison, do you want to? I think the answer is that the paleo fossil records aren't as good. What is it? Allison, I'm going to let you answer that too.
Yeah, no worries.
That is your question.
Yeah, in Europe specifically, there's a mismatch between where most of the fossil records so all of the data we pulled is from a herbivore traits database, and the fossil occurrences that go into that database mostly are from Northern Europe, where if we're looking at grassy systems, we're going to be looking at like around the Black Sea. So that's where most of the fire records are coming from. There's a very scant fire records anyway and a mismatch. So we just didn't feel that we had the confidence to include Europe in our analysis. For Asia, the fossil record is so sparse that we also didn't feel, and the fire record, both there's data problems for both of them. So we just couldn't incorporate either of those continents, unfortunately. But if we improve our data, then maybe we can add this in at another time. So.
Okay, great, thanks. Caleb, you have a question?
Thanks for hello, how you hear me?
Just about, yeah, it's a bit slow. It's okay.
Okay, so I need to know if you sorry for the video. My internet is very bad, so I cannot
Okay, lost you, I think. Okay, I'm going to ask you.
I think he put his question in the chat. So I think
to know if yes, I put my question on the chat. If you can take it and.
Okay, so the question in the chat is.
I would like to know if you have more precise. Yes, I would like to know if you have more data about the impact of antelopes like.
I think on woody biomass and the Sahelian biome, very the question. So,
yeah. I would like to know if you have some data about that.
That's a very easy question to answer in the sense that I personally don't have any data about that question. It's an interesting question whether such data are available. I know that Gareth Hempson, so there's two components of all of these analyses. One is the herbivore exclusion side. So what happened, like estimating herbivore impacts on vegetation via exclusion studies. And then the other is understanding the current state of herbivore biomass in a lot of these systems. So Gareth Hempson has done a really beautiful job in his 2015 and 2017 papers of synthesizing what is available and what is known in terms of herbivore biomass density, herbivore species composition, and so on across African savannas. And that does include West Africa. And so information about data about that are available. And Gareth is the right person to talk to about that. And if you sort of want to get at least a general introduction, you can take a look at his both 2015 and 2017 papers. In terms of herbivore exclusion studies, I'm not actually aware of herbivore exclusion studies that have been done in West Africa, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. Yadvinder, you might know better than I do. You've done so much work in West Africa. What's the?
I haven't. There may be some. I haven't come across any. My time.
Yeah, so it's the impact. My understanding is that it's the impact side that's difficult. But I mean, what we've done in Southern and East Africa basically argues that if you know something about herbivore biomass, you ought to be able to predict something that's very strong about herbivore impacts on, at least grazer impacts on grass. And so you may not actually need direct I mean, obviously it would be preferable to have a direct evaluation of herbivore impact on the grass layer. I think it's an interesting, I mean, just because you asked specifically about woody biomass, I think that question, I mean, I was actually, truthfully, I'm going to say I was really surprised that there was such a strong relationship between browser density and tree effects. Because I have always been of the opinion that demographic bottlenecks really matter a lot for browser impacts on trees, right? And that essentially the argument, you know, I've written papers about this question, right? Where like browsers eat seedlings and saplings, and that has a multiplicative and outsized impact on tree establishment. And so I was really surprised. I was very genuinely surprised to see that relationship coming out. It's a little bit weaker than the grazer relationship, but it is there. And so at least, I mean, if you're going to trust those data, the claim would be that any system that has a lot of browsing, so that'd be mixed feeder and browser organisms, should have lots of woody impacts. But I'm not, you know, I don't know. I'm like maybe a little bit skeptical of that. But anyways, that's not a very good answer, but it was certainly long and rambling. Nikki, do you have a question?
I just wanted to ask you quickly about what you just spoke about with the browser impacts. You're surprised that they have such a clear impact. Do you account for species impacts? There must be quite a clear differential species impact that you may have an impact, but you filtering a species or functional type quite strongly.
We did not. We just took whatever they, you know, like whatever somebody measured, we just, you know, threw it in there as a, and actually, to be honest, because those are response ratios, it's really just like the crudest tool in data synthesis is to just look at the, you know, basically outside divided by inside. And we therefore include, like, it includes metrics like seedling survival versus tree height versus, I mean, it's just like a whole mess of everything. And so in that case, you know, I mean, I don't think the grass biomass results are all that controversial, but I think on the tree side, it sort of strikes me as possible that it's just an accident that we found a pattern there. But that's not to be, that is, you know, but we did find it. And so you know, I'm sort of a little bit surprised by that, but it's all sorts of measurements across all sorts of species. And we didn't control for, we obviously collected information on what measurements had been taken. But it's a hodgepodge of data in that case. And actually, it's also some data on growth. So that would be like incremental change, and then some data on standing biomass. And so that is not incremental change, that's accumulated change. So it really, I mean, it's a true hodgepodge in that case. It's not the part of the synthesis that is strongest by any means. And I think there's a lot more to do on that side of things.
Mm-hmm. I'll pop in another question. I was struck by the metabolic scaling argument you made, where once you found a higher slope coefficient for African species, applied that, you got quite a good match between your observed biomass loss and your predicted consumption. So two parts of the question. Firstly, when you first showed the 2 times effect, I also wondered whether things like other damage that isn't consumption could be a factor, like just trampling and soil compression, and these factors would be reducing biomass. So you'd expect a mismatch between consumption and effects on vegetation in the direction you found first anyway. But then once you've got a match, what do you think it drives it? What the higher, steeper coefficient means is that large animals eat disproportionately more biomass than you find in relationships in other continents. And what could be driving that steeper slope in the African context?
Okay, so 2 answers to that question. I think I can answer the first one a little bit more satisfactorily, and then I'm going to give you somebody else's answer for number 2. So the first part is that we actually wound up sort of convincing ourselves that the trampling issue wasn't that important. And so the reason that we convinced ourselves of the argument that I would make for you there is that if issues like if trampling were really important, you would see grazers mattering for browser responses to exclusion and browsers mattering for grass responses to exclusion. right? And what we see is like feeding guild specific responses. Like, so the preferred model is always feeding guild specific and not responsive to the whole herbivore community, which I think is essentially an argument that it shouldn't be about nutrient recycling feedbacks, and it shouldn't be about trampling, and it shouldn't be about any of these other secondary effects that herbivores could have, right? Again, you'd have to believe what is essentially a fairly sparse data set, and it's reading a lot into a sparse data set. And people have certainly found that there are nutrient recycling effects to having herbivores and trampling effects to having herbivores. I think that's the big uncertainty for me about the effect of, like, the place where I would imagine that would be most important would be, for instance, in the Serengeti, if you have migratory herbivores trampling tree seedlings, or eating tree seedlings. And so we're calling it basically grazers shouldn't eat trees, but maybe they are eating tree seedlings. And so that's why I put a question mark on the effect of migratory grazers on trees in the past, right? I don't think I would like to extrapolate. And that's especially true because the herbivore exclusions that have been applied in the Serengeti have been almost exclusively focused on grass, and the tree data in that system is very sparse, right? And so I would love to see like a better, larger, more robust set of herbivore exclusion experiments that explicitly look at basically like high grazer density effects on trees too, and whether there are some like trampling or nutrient recycling effects that we just don't know about yet. Okay, question number 2 was about so why do herbivores, I'm gonna have to like stretch back. I have a terrible memory, but Lovegrove addresses this question specifically. And I think the argument is essentially that like that in order to basically prime the ability to like run away from stuff, you have to you have to have a high basal metabolic rate in order to be able to activate like activity better. And so I think they make, if I'm trying to remember here, I think they make an argument about having to like run away from stuff. And maintaining the ability to run away from stuff is metabolically expensive, basically. Allison, do you remember? You read that too, right?
Yeah, I don't really have anything additional to add. Yeah.
But that is the explicit Lovegrove 2000. It's a good read, and you should check it out. And he does tackle that explicitly. So
I'll look into that. And there's more things to run away, at least currently in Africa, than in other continents. So
right, exactly.
Interesting. Okay, Kate.
Hi, Carla. Thank you for that. That was great. I'm going to have to talk about the elephant in the room, which of course isn't an elephant, it's the invertebrates. So, so yeah, where do they fit in to this? Because that's
such a good question. We wrote this as the past, present, future of herbivore impact as a review, and I wrote an outline to the editor that was like very apologetic about the fact that we were just going to do like mammal impacts, and he was like, "You don't have to do everything. You don't have to apologize." And so like we wound up not being all that apologetic in the review. But I'm like very aware of the fact that that isn't a component that we tackled at all. And I obviously you're the right person to answer that question, and I am not. So where do you think they fit in? Can I make you answer your own question? Tell me about it. Where do you think like the scale? Do you think the scale of invert impacts is of a magnitude that's comparable to the mammals?
Well, so I work in Kruger found that in the wet season, offtake by invertebrates was greater than vertebrates. In the dry season, it was the vertebrates because the invertebrates are all not active. So maybe over the course of the year, the vertebrates went out. But yeah, that's certainly during the growing season, the invertebrates take off a lot. What I don't know, and what I was thinking about with all these herbivore exclusions, is that if the invertebrate effect was the same across all those exclusions, well, then it wouldn't necessarily matter if you're still looking at the vertebrates. But we don't know actually if the invertebrate offtake varies depending on grass biomass, because perhaps you get different types of grasshoppers. For instance, you would get different types of grasshoppers, and we don't know how that offtake then varies. But yeah, it'd just be fun if we could start thinking about it.
I agree with that. I can conclusively tell you that we just sort of, none of these experiments did like it's like a large mesh fence, right? So we sort of like crossed our fingers and hoped that you know, we didn't manipulate any inverts, and so they're not having some large effect. But you make a good argument for why it does matter. I guess you could go sample, like you could go sample community composition across, like there are, you know, it's something like, you know, what, 10 or 12 herbivore experiments across Africa. What is there a consistent effect on invert biomass and
yeah, so it'd be fun to sort of do a paired kind of nested experiment. So you've got your large mammalian herbivore exclosures, and then within that you set up some invertebrate exclosures, and then you also go and measure your invertebrate biomass, and then you can nail it. So let's do it. Okay,
it's a great idea. I like it.
Okay. Thanks.
Great. Nikki? Is that like old hands? Okay. Okay.
Absolute horror and surprise.
Okay. Perhaps I'll ask one more question then. I was really struck by your cross-continent comparison of grazer loss and fire. And that was really nice. I'm really looking forward to seeing that paper. It sounds like you're close to having something there. It's really interesting. And I was thinking about what it means because there's an effect size. I didn't know what the absolute magnitudes were, but thinking of the Brazilian Cerrado, for example, I think Bill Hoffman's there in the audience as well. How much of a difference in fire regime would there have been prior to the grazer extinctions in South America compared to post-extinction? And what does that tell us about the existing fire adaptation we see in South America compared to what the historical fire regime would have been? And I'm not expecting a clear answer, but it makes me wonder whether the Cerrado shifted from being a herbivore-dominated system, a brown world, to a black world, in Bond speak, at the end of the Pleistocene.
I think we should also get Allison involved in the answer to this question. But I think, sorry, Allison, you can have the answer all my questions. Make Kate answer half my questions and Allison answer the other half. I think that so the relative changes, like those fire activity composites are like there is a lot of fire. It's not like a complete you don't like flip a switch from brown to black world, right? It's a relative change, and so it you know, there is some fire activity even before the switch. So, you know, whether that's composed of like a blanket, I'm sure that it's not a blanket change from everything, you know, like not everything changes in its fire activity by the same magnitude, and there's probably a lot of like local heterogeneity in how much herbivore extinctions affect fire activity. And so it could be that like some sites contribute more, it could be that, and that's even true within a paleo record if it's aggregating over some like large landscape scale. That would be, you know, so my guess would be that, well, I think we could be fairly confident that there was still a lot of fire dependent savannas in South America even before the mega herbivore extinctions. That would be my component of the answer. So it's not to say, you know, I mean, I think the idea that there is a fire adapted flora that is older, I don't think it necessarily has any bearing on that. That could be a more widespread and more dominant flora than today than it was then. I don't know, Allison, would you answer that differently? What would you say in response to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think you like kind of got it. I think that the thing with what we did is like each of the records is like a compilation of a bunch of different continental records that are compared to each other within each continent. So making comparisons between them is impossible to do properly. So like in terms of like magnitude or switch flipping, I think it's hard to say that with what we did and with our data set. But I think that I think what it does show is that the scales are big. And so that means that it's something we probably need to think about more and interrogate in a more explicit way. But yeah, I think you do see like switch flipping at like some of those records from specific sites, like Jackie Gill's work in North America and stuff like that. But I don't think at the scale we're looking at, we don't see evidence for it. And yeah.
Do you see, is this allowed? Am I allowed to now ask Allison a question?
Go ahead.
If you were to look at each of the individual fire records from, say, South America or Africa, like, would you is the composite made up of some change across all records, or are there some records that really go from lots of fire activity to very little? Like how heterogeneous, how is the composite made up of very heterogeneous local responses, or is it made up of like somewhat consistent local responses?
I think the answer to both of those is yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
But
Okay.
we haven't quite done that in-depth analysis because we don't have the herbivore data resolution to
Oh,
do
course.
like comparisons.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. That I know. Yeah. That's interesting.
Okay, any more questions? If not, I think we can wrap up for today. And in seminar tradition, we ask you to unmute your microphones and give an audible round of applause and open your video cameras as well. So thanks, Carla. Terrific seminar. Very, really thought-provoking. Loads of fascinating ideas there.
Thank you so much. This was really fun. It's always great talking to you guys. See you soon.
Yeah, see you. And all be on YouTube. I'll post it on YouTube later this evening as well, so if you want to share with colleagues.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Bye.